The last radio transmission of the USS Eldridge. A supernatural escape. Have you ever heard the tale of a ship that disappeared into thin air? Of a crew that one moment was there, and the next was gone, never to be heard from again? No? Well, buckle up, because what you're about to hear isn't just a story. It's a mystery that has confounded the world for decades, and the truth behind it is still elusive. It was the year 1943, and the world was entrenched in the chaos of World War II. The U.S. Navy, always at the forefront of cutting-edge technology, had been working on something no one had ever seen before. The project was supposed to be a game-changer, an experiment so revolutionary that its consequences, whatever they were, would never be fully understood. The USS Eldridge, a naval warship, was chosen for the experiment. A ship that would undergo a procedure designed to render it invisible to enemy radar. It sounds like science fiction, doesn't it? Something you'd expect to hear about in a book or a movie. But this was real. Or was it? And then, it happened. The USS Eldridge vanished. No one knows exactly what happened that day. Some say it was a freak accident. Others say the Eldridge disappeared, not just from view, but from time itself. But the strangest part? The last radio transmission of the USS Eldridge was recorded just before it disappeared. A chilling message that didn't make sense. Men were not alone. The voice that crackled through the airwaves was full of panic and confusion. But that wasn't the end of it. That transmission would send shockwaves across the globe, launching theories, conspiracies, and investigations that continue to this day. What happened to the Eldridge? Was it a case of a failed experiment? Or did something supernatural take hold of the ship and its crew? Let's take a step back. In 1943, the United States Navy was working on something top secret, something with the potential to alter the course of the war. The project was called the Philadelphia Experiment. It was an attempt to develop a way to cloak ships from enemy radar, making them invisible. The theory behind it involved powerful electromagnetic fields that would distort the ship's appearance, bending light and possibly even space itself. But there was a dark side to this experiment that no one anticipated. The plan wasn't just to make the ship invisible to radar. No, the ultimate goal was to make it invisible in every way, to make it disappear entirely, even from the fabric of reality. And that's where things took a turn no one could have predicted. The USS Eldridge was the guinea pig for this unprecedented experiment, and the results? Well, they were far more terrifying than anyone had imagined. One day, the Eldridge's crew found themselves caught in an intense electromagnetic storm. The air was thick with static, and strange phenomena began to unfold before their eyes. Crew members reported strange, shifting lights, the sensation of time warping, and a sense of being pulled. Some swore they saw figures, warped, distorted, standing at the edges of their vision, but when they turned to look, no one was there. It was like the very space around the ship was bending and warping. And then, in the blink of an eye, the ship was gone. No warning, no explanation. It simply vanished. What's even more unsettling is that the disappearance didn't just involve the Eldridge. There were reports of ghostly figures appearing in its place. Soldiers who hadn't been seen for decades. Some said they could hear the voices of the crew, but when they looked around, there was no one there. Others claimed that they saw the ship flicker in and out of existence, as though it was caught in some kind of dimensional limbo. What was happening to the USS Eldridge? What had they done to the very fabric of reality? You might be thinking, that sounds like something out of a sci-fi novel. And you're right. It's easy to dismiss this story as just another piece of wild conspiracy theory. But the thing is, this isn't just some far-fetched tale. There were actual witnesses to these events. People who saw the strange phenomena, who felt the cold air around them when the ship disappeared. And there's the last radio transmission. That message. What did it mean? Was it a cry for help from the crew who had no idea what they had unleashed? Or was it something more sinister? The transmission, full of static and fear, was the last known communication from the USS Eldridge. And yet there were no further reports about the ship's whereabouts. No one knew where it went, why it vanished, or if anyone on board had survived. All the Navy would say was that the experiment was a failure. But what exactly had failed? The experiment itself? Or something deeper, something beyond human understanding? So, what happened to the USS Eldridge? For decades, that question remained unanswered. But whispers began to circulate about the truth behind the Philadelphia experiment. They weren't just whispers from conspiracy theorists. Some former Navy officers, veterans who had witnessed the experiment, started to talk. They said things that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up. They spoke of strange occurrences during the experiment, things they couldn't explain, things that went beyond the limits of physics. And then, there were the survivors, the few who had somehow managed to escape the horrors that befell the Eldridge. They had their own stories to tell, stories that raised more questions than they answered. But there was one thing they all agreed on. Something supernatural had happened that day. Something that couldn't be explained by science or reason. Now I'm sure you're sitting there, wondering, can this really be true? Can something so bizarre, so unexplainable, actually happen in real life? Well, here's the thing. This isn't just a story, it's a mystery. One that's been waiting to be solved for more than 80 years. And in this video, we're going to dive deep into the unknown. We'll explore the evidence, hear from the people who lived through it, and maybe, just maybe, we'll uncover the truth behind the last radio transmission of the USS Eldridge. But first, I want you to think about this. What if the Eldridge didn't just disappear? What if it escaped to another dimension? What if the ship didn't vanish, but shifted into another reality entirely? Could it be that the crew, lost to time and space, are still out there, somewhere? Keep watching, because we're only just getting started. You don't want to miss what comes next. And don't forget, leave a comment if you think this story could be true. Hit that like button if you're intrigued. And most importantly, subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter in this mind-bending mystery. The USS Eldridge had vanished. One minute it was there, anchored in the calm waters, and the next, it was gone. Just like that. No warning, no explanation, no real clue about what had happened. But the strangest part? The crew's last transmission had set the stage for what was to come. A cryptic message, full of static, fear, and confusion. Men, we're not alone. That one line had echoed through the radio waves, haunting those who heard it and igniting questions that have never been fully answered. As authorities scrambled to cover up the incident, whispers started to surface. Whispers from the people who had been there, the witnesses, the ones who had seen the ship's disappearance. Some said the ship didn't just disappear. They claimed it shifted, slipping into another dimension, leaving behind only a trail of broken airwaves and trembling memories. But was that really possible? In the days following the event, things only got stranger. The crew of the Eldridge had vanished without a trace, but those left behind, soldiers, sailors, and civilians, soon began to see strange signs. Ghostly figures that flickered in and out of existence, phantom ships drifting through the mist, and most chilling of all, a series of unexplainable lights that seemed to pulse in the sky, as though the very fabric of time itself was stretching and warping around them. One soldier, a man named Thomas Bradley, swore that he had seen the Eldridge, not in the flesh, but in the skies above the ocean, a fleeting shadow that passed through the clouds, leaving behind nothing but an eerie silence. "I saw it," he said, "hovering like a ghost, like it wasn't even there. But it was there. I could feel it." Bradley wasn't the only one. In fact, a number of sailors from nearby ships reported seeing something similar, bright, glowing lights in the sky that flickered like stars trapped in a storm. The phenomenon wasn't confined to just one area. It spread across the waters, moving from the Navy Yard to other bases. Some described the lights as a dull green, others as a harsh white, but all who saw them agreed on one thing: they had never seen anything like it before. Then came the sounds, low, humming noises that vibrated through the air, rattling windows and setting nerves on edge. For those who stood close enough to the shipyards, they could feel the hum in their bones, a sound that didn't just seem out of place, it seemed wrong. It was as though the air itself was vibrating with some hidden energy, one that no one could explain. Some of the men who had been stationed at the naval base described hearing what could only be called voices. Not the voices of any human, but something older, something more primal. One sailor reported hearing laughter, chilling and echoing, coming from the direction of the Eldridge's dock, even though no one was there. Another spoke of whispers, faint and indistinct, almost as if they were carried by the wind. But what was more terrifying was the fact that when they tried to follow the sound, it would disappear, leaving only the eerie silence of the night. Even stranger still were the strange apparitions reported by those who had ventured close to the site where the Eldridge had been docked. One man, Thomas Wilkes, claimed that he saw soldiers, ghostly soldiers, walking along the pier, their figures fading in and out of existence. They wore old-fashioned military uniforms, with hats and equipment that looked like something from the past, not from the present day. He described them as translucent, almost as if they were phantoms, yet their movements were fluid, natural, and eerily lifelike. At first, Wilkes thought they were part of a reenactment or some sort of training exercise, but as he approached, the figures began to dissipate into thin air. He blinked. They were gone. Could these apparitions be connected to the fate of the Eldridge? Were the soldiers who had been on board still lingering in some way, trapped between worlds, unable to escape the consequences of the experiment? And then there was the message, the final transmission that still haunted everyone involved. The phrase, "We're not alone," kept ringing in their ears, but it wasn't just a warning. It was a sign. It was as if the crew had been trying to communicate something they couldn't explain, but something they felt deep within them. What were they trying to tell us? Were they trying to warn us of something greater? Or did they just want someone to know the truth? The truth. That word carried so much weight. And yet, after all these years, no one seemed any closer to understanding what had really happened on that fateful day. The experiments had been covered up, the records erased, and the witnesses, those few who remained, were left with only their fragmented memories and unsettling accounts. But there were a few who believed the truth was still out there. And one man, an eccentric researcher by the name of Dr. Harold Simmons, was determined to find it. Simmons had spent decades investigating the Philadelphia experiment, piecing together fragments of evidence that others had dismissed as nonsense. He'd collected reports, testimonies, and even photographs that hinted at the bizarre nature of the Eldridge's disappearance. Dr. Simmons had a theory, one that he couldn't yet prove, but one he was sure of. He believed that the Eldridge had slipped into another dimension, a parallel world, and that the strange lights and sounds were merely the echoes of that other reality. The crew of the Eldridge, he argued, were still alive, trapped in a place that no one could reach, but a place they were constantly trying to escape. As we move forward with this investigation, you might be asking yourself, Could this really be possible? Could the Eldridge have shifted into another reality? Could its crew still be out there, trying to make contact, trying to return to their own time? These are questions that have plagued scientists, theorists, and researchers for decades. But the truth is, no one knows. Not yet. In the next part, we'll dive deeper into the story, as we uncover more signs that the Eldridge's fate wasn't just a freak accident. It was part of something much bigger, something far more mysterious. And just maybe, we'll come closer to uncovering the true meaning of that last transmission. We're not alone. Don't go anywhere. This is just the beginning. The Philadelphia experiment was, and still is, one of the most controversial and eerie chapters in naval history. But for all the theories, all the speculations, there was one man whose story, whose experience, was crucial in understanding what really happened. His name was Charles H. Stevens, a sailor who was aboard the USS Eldridge on that fateful day. The man who survived, or rather, the man who escaped. When you hear the word survivor, you probably picture someone who walked away from a disaster, someone who lived to tell the tale. But for Charles Stevens, surviving wasn't just about walking away. It was about grappling with a reality that no one should ever have to face. Charles was just a young man when he was assigned to the USS Eldridge. Fresh-faced, eager to serve, he had no idea that his life would soon be tangled in the fabric of the impossible. He had joined the Navy during the war, just another face in a sea of recruits. But on the night of the experiment, he would become something else entirely. A man marked by a mystery that, to this day, still haunts him. Charles had always been an average sailor, nothing remarkable about him. That was until that night. The night the Eldridge disappeared. The night everything he knew about reality, time, and space was shattered. He wasn't the first to notice something was wrong. It started with a strange hum, low and persistent. At first, it was just background noise, something no one could explain but everyone felt. And then, as the hum grew louder, a heavy pressure seemed to build in the air. It wasn't physical, at least not in the way we understand pressure. It was like something invisible was pressing against them, making their skin crawl. The crew was already on edge, their nerves stretched thin from the war, but now something else was happening. Something they couldn't explain. The first signs came when the ship's lights began to flicker, not like a normal electrical issue, but as if the very electricity itself was being bent, warped. The lights dimmed and brightened in unnatural rhythms. Stevens remembers feeling his heart race as the ship began to shake, a violent trembling that rattled the walls and sent the crew scrambling for their stations. It felt like the ship was coming apart. And then, the air seemed to bend, not physically, but in the way a mirage distorts the desert. Stevens watched, wide-eyed, as the outlines of the ship began to shimmer, almost as though the ship itself was being torn from reality. He could see through it, through the ship, for brief moments. The ocean beyond the ship seemed to swirl and pulse, as if it, too, was caught in the same warp in time and space. And in those moments, everything felt wrong. Charles Stevens wasn't the only one who noticed. The crew was in chaos. Some screamed, others ran for cover, and a few just stood there, frozen. Some reported hearing faint whispers, like voices from another time, another place. At first, they thought it was a hallucination, a trick of the mind brought on by stress and fatigue. But then, they saw something, someone, who wasn't supposed to be there. One of the officers, a man named Lieutenant William Grant, swore he saw a man standing at the edge of the deck. The man wasn't part of the crew, yet there he was, staring into the distance. When Grant approached him, the figure turned, only for Grant to freeze in place. The man's face was not human. at least not in the way any of them understood. The face was distorted, like a reflection in a broken mirror. It flickered, shifting, as though it wasn't fully there. Grant shouted, "Who are you?" But the figure didn't respond. Instead, it turned and faded, right before his eyes. The event left Grant shaken, his hands trembling as he relayed the sighting to Stevens and the others. But no one knew what to make of it. Was it just a trick of the light? Was it a hallucination brought on by fear? Or was it something far more sinister? Stevens, who had seen the ship literally flicker in and out of existence, didn't need to be told twice. Something was terribly wrong. And when he went to check the ship's radio, that's when the chilling transmission crackled through the speakers. "Men, we're not alone." It was clear. Something was happening. Something beyond their understanding. But it wasn't just the strange lights, the distorted images, or the whispers. What really sent Stevens into panic was the sudden, violent change in the atmosphere. One moment, the ship was still. The next, the ship moved. But not like it was supposed to. It was as if the Eldridge was shifting through space, sliding across dimensions, as though it was being yanked and pulled by invisible hands. And then, in a flash of light, it was gone. Stevens remembers the weightlessness, the strange sensation that he was no longer on the ship at all. One second, he was standing on deck, and the next, he was standing on solid ground, but not the ground of the Eldridge. It was as though he had stepped out of time itself. The world around him was different. The air was still, too still. The sky, a dull gray, seemed unnatural. The temperature was odd, too cold for a summer's day. He had no idea how long he was standing there. It felt like hours, but he couldn't be sure. All he knew was that the ship was gone, and with it, so were the rest of the crew. There was no trace of the Eldridge anywhere, and Stevens found himself alone, in a place that didn't belong to any world he recognized. As Stevens wandered through the strange, empty landscape, he began to feel the eerie pull of an unseen presence. It was as if someone, was watching him. He wasn't alone. He could feel it. But when he turned around, there was nothing. That's when he heard it. The same whispers, faint but clear. They were speaking to him, calling his name, urging him to follow. It wasn't a voice from a person, but something far older, far more ancient. Stevens tried to ignore it, but the whispers grew louder, more insistent, until finally, in the distance, he saw it. The Eldridge, or at least something that looked like it. The ship flickered, appearing and disappearing in front of his eyes, as though it was caught between worlds. And in that fleeting moment, Stevens understood. The ship hadn't just disappeared. It had shifted, and so had the crew. But before he could reach it, the ship vanished once again, leaving only silence behind. And then, a voice. "We're not alone." That was the last thing Stevens heard before he collapsed from exhaustion. When he woke up, he was back on the Eldridge, as though no time had passed at all. But the world around him had changed. The crew was there, but they were no longer the same. Some didn't speak. Others seemed lost, as if they had forgotten everything. And Stevens never spoke of what happened in that strange dimension again. But he knew. He had seen it. He had been there. And that knowledge would haunt him for the rest of his life. Charles Stevens would become the key to understanding the mysteries of the Philadelphia experiment. He would live, but what he had escaped from was not something that anyone could understand, at least not in the way we understand reality. In the next part of this story, we'll dive deeper into the questions that no one had the answers to. What exactly happened to the crew of the Eldridge? Were they trapped in a parallel universe? And more importantly, What was waiting for them when they were pulled into that other dimension? Hold tight, because we're about to uncover even more secrets. Charles Stevens had lived through something that defied every law of science, every rule of the known world. He had been pulled into a dimension that didn't make sense, witnessed things that shouldn't exist, and yet he had survived. But the terror didn't end with his return. In fact, that's when things started to spiral even further out of control. After Stevens returned to the ship, he wasn't the same. It wasn't just the confusion on his face or the haunted look in his eyes. It was the way he moved, the way he behaved. The crew noticed it immediately. He wasn't talking about the events that had happened, not at first. Instead, he began avoiding others, his eyes darting nervously around the ship as though he could see something they couldn't, as if the shadows themselves were watching him. At first, his behavior was dismissed as the result of stress, of the unimaginable horror of the experiment. But then, something began to happen that no one could ignore. The strange events that had plagued the ship before started happening again. And this time, they were even more intense, more terrifying. The first sign came at night. A strange glow appeared over the ocean, an eerie, unnatural light that flickered and pulsed like a dying star. Some of the crew swore it was the Eldridge, appearing in the distance, only to vanish as quickly as it had come. Others reported hearing footsteps echoing through the halls of the ship, but when they checked, no one was there. It wasn't just an ordinary haunting, though. The ship itself seemed to be alive, breathing, shifting. But it wasn't just the lights or the sounds. The air itself had changed. It grew thick, almost suffocating. Every breath felt heavy, as if the very atmosphere had been altered. The temperature fluctuated, from an unnatural cold that seeped into the bones to a stifling heat that made it hard to think. And then the voices started. Some of the crew members began hearing whispers in the dark. Faint, distant voices, like murmurs carried on the wind. They would hear their names being called, but when they turned around, no one would be there. Others began to experience more vivid hallucinations, visions of soldiers who had long been dead, walking through the halls of the ship. At first, they thought it was just fatigue playing tricks on their minds, but the images were too real, too distinct. One sailor, Private Richard Jansen, swore he saw a figure standing at the end of the hall, a man in uniform, his face obscured by shadow. When Jansen approached, the figure disappeared into the walls, leaving only a lingering chill behind. Jansen wasn't the only one. Several others had similar experiences, each one more disturbing than the last. The strange, fleeting figures, half-formed and disappearing the moment they were seen, seemed to follow them everywhere. Then came the unexplainable phenomenon that no one could deny. The ship, once steady in the waters, began to shake again. But this time it wasn't just a tremor. It felt like the entire ship was being pulled somewhere, like it was being torn apart by forces beyond anyone's comprehension. Stevens, already on edge, couldn't take it any longer. He'd seen it before, the bending of space, the distortion of time, and he knew, deep down, that whatever was happening was connected to that fateful experiment. But even Stevens was stunned when he witnessed what happened next. One evening, as the crew gathered in the mess hall, the lights began to flicker once again, and then, as though in response to some unseen signal, the ship seemed to pulse. A low hum filled the air, vibrating through the walls and floors, making the very ground beneath their feet seem unstable. Some of the crew members clutched their heads, as if they could feel the pressure building in their skulls, the weight of something beyond this world pressing in on them. And then, the walls started to shift. It was subtle at first, like the edges of the ship's structure were warping, as if the metal itself was bending. The ceiling buckled slightly, and the floor beneath them rippled in waves. Some of the crew screamed in terror, but others stood frozen, unable to comprehend what they were witnessing. The air around them felt wrong, like they were in a space that wasn't supposed to exist. That's when Stevens snapped. He couldn't take it anymore. He bolted from the mess hall and rushed to the control room, where the ship's radar and communication equipment were located. He had to know what was happening. When he arrived, he was greeted by a chilling sight. The radar screens were glowing, not with the usual blips of ships and planes in the area, but with something else. The signals were erratic, flashing in patterns that made no sense. It was like something was there, something invisible, something not from their world. And that's when the most terrifying realization hit Stevens. The ship wasn't just experiencing strange phenomena, it was slipping again. The ship wasn't just bending space, it was being pulled through it. The lights on the radar flickered, and for a brief moment, Stevens thought he saw the outline of a ship in the distance. Not the Eldridge, but something different. A ship that wasn't supposed to be there. Something from another dimension, another time. The ship groaned, a deep, metallic sound that seemed to come from the very heart of it. The air grew colder. The walls, the floors, even the air itself seemed to ripple like a disturbed pool of water. Stevens looked out the porthole. The world outside wasn't the world he knew. It was wrong. The sky was a sickly green, and the water had taken on an unnatural hue, almost as if it was alive, shifting and undulating beneath the ship. Stevens rushed to the radio and began sending out distress signals, but nothing happened. The ship was cut off. The crew was alone. They were trapped, and whatever was happening wasn't just happening to the ship, it was happening to them. Strange things began to occur aboard the ship. Crew members began to behave erratically. Some wandered aimlessly through the halls, muttering to themselves. Others fell into deep, trance-like states, unable to wake up. Their eyes would flutter open, and they would speak in voices that weren't their own. Whispers from the past, from soldiers long dead. One man, Corporal Samuel Thompson, swore he saw the ghost of a soldier from another era, a figure in tattered military gear who beckoned him to follow. Thompson, terrified, tried to run, but his feet wouldn't move. He was frozen in place, as if the very air around him had stopped him from leaving. When he managed to break free, the figure had vanished, leaving only the lingering scent of something old in the air. And then the final straw came. The ship's systems started to fail. Power grids malfunctioned. Communications went silent. The crew was isolated, cut off from the world they knew. No one knew what to do. Panic began to set in as the eerie phenomena grew stronger, more persistent. Stevens could only wonder, was the ship slipping through dimensions once again? Had the experiment failed so terribly that it had shattered the very fabric of reality? Or was this just the beginning of something much worse? The tension aboard the USS Eldridge was reaching a boiling point. The crew was falling apart. And Stevens, the only one who had experienced the horrors of the other world, was running out of time. The next part of the story will delve even deeper into the strange events aboard the ship. The whispers will grow louder, the figures will become more distinct, and the crew will face something even more terrifying than before. Because now, the question wasn't just about survival. It was about escaping the very nightmare that had been unleashed. Stay with us. This is only getting more intense. As the tension on the USS Eldridge reached its breaking point, Charles Stevens felt himself slipping further into the nightmare. The distortions, the apparitions, the whispers, they were no longer fleeting, no longer background anomalies. They had become the reality of the ship. And in that new, unexplainable reality, There was no escaping the past. The ship wasn't just haunted by strange forces, it was tethered to them. And Stevens knew that the only way to survive, to understand what was happening, was to look backward. But the past, as he would soon learn, wasn't just a series of disconnected events. It was the key to everything. The experiment, the strange phenomena, the ghostly encounters, they were all bound together by something far deeper than anyone had realized. The Eldridge, it seemed, had become a conduit for something far more ancient and powerful than the men aboard it could comprehend. Stevens began to recall fragments of the past, the very night of the experiment. Before the ship vanished, before the strange lights appeared, before reality itself began to fracture, he had heard another voice. It wasn't the ghostly whispers that now haunted the ship. It was something louder, clearer, more deliberate. In the final moments before the ship disappeared, Stevens had been on deck, standing alone, staring into the ocean. His mind was racing, grappling with the surreal nature of what was unfolding. He had barely understood what was happening, let alone what was about to happen. But that voice, it broke through the confusion. "Do you hear that?" he had asked one of the officers standing nearby. "It's calling us. Whatever this is, it's not from here." The officer, a man named Lieutenant David Foster, looked at him, his face pale. Foster had been one of the last people to witness the Eldridge flicker in and out of existence. He too had heard the voice. But there was something more, something Stevens had missed in his haze of panic. "I thought it was just me," Foster admitted, his voice trembling. But it wasn't. The ship was speaking. Foster's words echoed in Stevens' mind now as he paced the halls of the ship, the walls groaning with the strange energy that seemed to pulse from them. What was it? Was the Eldridge alive in some way? Or was it merely the vessel, an unknowing conduit for forces far beyond human understanding? As Stevens dug deeper into the memories of that night, he began to uncover something that had been overlooked, something that had been hidden for decades. The original idea behind the Philadelphia experiment wasn't just to make the ship invisible. That was the surface goal. The deeper, more dangerous ambition was to manipulate time itself. The experiment wasn't just about bending light, it was about bending reality. The experiment had been designed to create a temporal distortion, to allow the ship to travel through time and space. The scientists involved, some of whom had deep connections to the military-industrial complex, had been working on theories that suggested the existence of pocket dimensions, realms where the laws of physics didn't apply, where time could bend and twist. These pockets were theories, abstract ideas that had no real-world application, until the Eldridge. In their attempts to create invisibility, the scientists had unknowingly opened a door to one of these pocket dimensions. The ship had slipped, not just out of sight, but out of time. In an instant, the USS Eldridge had been thrust into a parallel world, a place where the crew had no anchor, no way of knowing whether they would ever return. And as it slipped through, it left a trace, like a scar on the fabric of space-time. But the crew hadn't just vanished. They had become trapped. Not dead, not completely gone. They had become stuck in between, caught in the void between dimensions, like shadows flung across a wall, flickering in and out of existence. And whatever happened to them in that alternate realm, it had left them marked. Stevens didn't need to be told twice. He knew now that the voices, the apparitions, the distortions, the crew wasn't just experiencing these things out of nowhere. They were trapped in the very realm the experiment had opened, a place that had twisted their perception of reality. It was as though they were living in two worlds at once, neither fully in the past nor the present. And the strange phenomena that now haunted the Eldridge were the echoes of that fracture in time. The next clue came from an unexpected source. Another sailor, John Kepler, had been one of the few who hadn't fully been affected by the strange energies of the ship. Kepler was an older man, one who had spent most of his life at sea. He had seen many things, but nothing like this. And yet, while most of the crew was succumbing to madness, he had retained his composure. One night, Kepler had ventured down to the hold, his instincts pulling him to a part of the ship that no one dared to enter. In the depths of the hull, Kepler found something he couldn't explain. It was an object, ancient-looking, covered in strange symbols, glowing faintly with an unearthly light. It was the artifact that had been left behind by the Eldridge's passage through time, a fragment of the pocket dimension the ship had encountered. And as Kepler touched it, the world around him seemed to flicker. The sounds of the ship faded, replaced by the echoes of a different time. He was no longer on the ship. He was back in another era. Kepler's experience was brief, but it confirmed something Stevens had suspected all along. The Eldridge wasn't just slipping through time, it was colliding with it. The ship was caught between two worlds, the world they had left behind and the one they had unwittingly entered. For a brief moment, Stevens understood the true scale of what had happened. The crew wasn't just haunted by ghosts, they were haunted by the past. The ship's journey through time had left ripples, echoes that couldn't be erased. The strange phenomena weren't just signs of supernatural forces, they were signs of an ancient, unresolved event that had bound the Eldridge to the alternate dimension. And those who had boarded the ship were now part of it, part of something much larger, much older than any of them could comprehend. The deeper Stevens delved into the mystery, the more he realized the danger wasn't just the haunting presence of the past. It was that the Eldridge and the crew were in danger of being swallowed by the very fabric of reality itself. The closer they came to understanding what had happened, the more they risked losing themselves forever. But Stevens couldn't turn back now. The mysteries of the past had already found their way into the present. And with each passing hour, the ship was growing closer to the edge of everything. In the next part, we'll explore what happens when the crew realizes just how far gone they are. The ship will begin to lose its grip on both dimensions, and the battle for survival will turn into something even more terrifying. It's not just about escaping anymore. It's about surviving the end of all things. Stay with us. The worst is yet to come. By now, the USS Eldridge was more than just a ship. It was a portal, a twisted vessel caught in a state of constant flux, a halfway point between dimensions. And with each passing day, the distortions grew more frequent, more violent. The crew was slowly unraveling. The thin thread that had held them together was snapping, and the eerie, inexplicable events were becoming impossible to ignore. It began with the whispers again. At first, they had been faint, almost inaudible. But now they were everywhere, echoing through the walls, rising from the very floor beneath them. Every man aboard the ship had heard them. They were clear, distinct, and inescapable. "You're not alone." The words would float into their minds without warning, as if the ship itself were speaking, sending out signals from somewhere deep within its bowels. The crew, once a solid, functioning unit, was falling apart. Some men barricaded themselves in their quarters, refusing to leave, while others wandered aimlessly, eyes glazed over as if they were searching for something, someone, that wasn't there. The ship had become a labyrinth of confusion, every corner twisting, every hallway leading to a dead end. It was a place where nothing made sense, where the rules of time and space had no power. And then came the appearances. The first one was barely noticeable, an odd figure in the distance, a shape too indistinct to make out clearly. Stevens had seen it first, standing near the edge of the deck, bathed in the strange, flickering light that had begun to seep through the ship. At first, he thought it was another crew member, maybe someone lost in the disorientation of the experiment's aftermath. But as he stepped closer, his stomach twisted in cold dread. The figure wasn't a man at all. It was a distorted silhouette, like a human form twisted and stretched by an unseen force. Stevens felt his breath catch in his throat as the figure turned, slowly, its face not a face at all, but a writhing mass of shadows, a featureless void that seemed to pulse in and out of existence. In a blink, it was gone, vanishing as suddenly as it had appeared. Stevens stumbled backward, his mind racing to make sense of what he had just seen. But he couldn't. How could he? There was no logical explanation for it. He was no longer on a ship. Not really. He was somewhere between worlds, somewhere that wasn't supposed to exist. The boundaries between the ship and the dimension they had entered were so thin now that everything was slipping through. The crew didn't have the luxury of being skeptical anymore. They had seen things. They had felt things. And they were terrified. The second appearance came a week later, and this time it wasn't just a figure. It was a man. Corporal Thomas McCall was one of the few men left who still attempted to function, as if the world hadn't collapsed around him. He kept to his duties, trying to ignore the strange occurrences that had become part of their daily routine. But one night, as he stood watch at the stern, he saw something that would forever change his understanding of reality. At first he thought he had misjudged it, his eyes, tired from too many sleepless nights, playing tricks on him. But no. As McCall squinted into the darkness, he could make out the figure of a man standing on the deck. His silhouette was stark against the glow of the moon, his uniform old and worn, its edges tattered from time. McCall's breath caught in his throat. The man was standing perfectly still, staring at something in the distance. He looked like a soldier, one of the men who had fought in wars long past. But there was something wrong about him. The man's face was pale, his eyes wide open but lifeless. And then, McCall realized something that made his heart stop. The soldier was bleeding, his chest was torn open, his uniform stained with dark, crusted blood. The figure's eyes slowly shifted to meet McCall's gaze. McCall froze, unable to look away. The soldier's mouth opened, as if trying to speak, but no sound came. The man's lips moved again, but still, the only thing McCall could hear was the deafening hum of the ship, the unnatural, grinding hum that seemed to vibrate through his very bones. Before McCall could move, the soldier began to fade, his form dissolving like mist in the air. One moment he was there, and the next, gone. McCall bolted, running back to the quarters, his mind reeling. He couldn't bring himself to speak of it to anyone. Who would believe him? A ghost? An apparition? A soldier from another time? What was happening on this cursed ship? What had they unleashed? But McCall wasn't the only one who had seen it. That same night, several others claimed to have witnessed similar phenomena. One man saw a woman, dressed in clothes from a bygone era, standing at the helm of the ship, staring into the water, while others saw flashes of soldiers, some of them bloodied and disfigured, their uniforms torn, their faces contorted in agony. Some of the crew members swore they saw flashes of a war-torn battlefield, bloodied skies, and exploding shells that seemed to hover just on the edge of their vision, as if the ship was trapped in some hellish loop of history. Each sighting was more vivid than the last, and the crew's sanity was slowly being eroded. The ship was no longer just a vessel. It was a time-warped, haunted prison. It was as if the crew was being forced to relive moments from wars past, trapped in a relentless cycle of terror, unable to escape. These weren't just ghost stories. They were echoes, remnants of a reality that had bled into their own. And the worst part? Stevens knew the worst was yet to come. The thing on the ship, the force that had trapped them, wasn't just showing them the past. It was inviting them to relive it, to step into it, to become part of it. What would they do when the past became so real, so tangible, that there was no way to tell if they were living in the present or trapped in the horrors of another time? Stevens wasn't sure how long the ship could keep it together. They had already crossed the threshold between dimensions. The line between the present and the past was blurring. The crew was seeing ghosts. They were living in ghosts. They had no idea if they were living in their own time anymore, or if they were becoming part of something that shouldn't exist. The ship was tearing at the seams, and Stevens could feel it. There was no way out, not without risking everything. In the next part, we will witness the crew's desperate attempt to break free from the haunted grip of the Eldridge. But they will find that escaping the nightmare is not as simple as they hoped. With the boundaries between worlds weakening, there may be no way to leave the ship, or the dimension it's trapped in. The clock is ticking, and the past is closing in. As the days dragged on aboard the USS Eldridge, the crew was teetering on the edge of madness. The line between the present and the past was now so blurred that no one could tell what was real and what was a shadow, a lingering echo from another time. The once proud vessel had become a prison, its halls haunted by spectral figures, distorted lights, and the suffocating hum of an unseen force pressing against the fabric of reality itself. Yet even amid the chaos and confusion, something even more disturbing began to emerge. Evidence. At first, it was nothing more than scattered fragments, odd markings on the walls, strange objects in places where they shouldn't have been, whispers of memories that felt too real to be mere imagination. The crew tried to rationalize it. Perhaps it was stress. Perhaps it was the isolation. But Stevens, who had seen the unexplainable firsthand, knew better. This wasn't just paranoia. They weren't just seeing things. Something was happening. Something that went beyond their understanding of physics, of time, of reality itself. The first piece of evidence came in the form of strange markings on the deck of the ship. One evening, as the crew tried to repair the ship's damaged communication systems that had been flickering in and out ever since the experiment, the engineers found something unsettling. Beneath the control panel, near the ship's main engine room, were peculiar scratches. At first glance, they seemed like the result of some mechanical malfunction. Sharp, jagged lines, almost as though a tool had been used carelessly. But the markings weren't consistent with any tool used in ship repairs. They were too deliberate, too artificial. One of the engineers, a man named Henry Caldwell, was the first to examine them closely. As he crouched to inspect the markings, he noticed something disturbing. They weren't just scratches. They were symbols. Symbols that shouldn't have existed in any naval logbook or engineering manual. They were strange, angular shapes, sharp and impossible to decipher. Caldwell's hand trembled as he traced the outline of one of the symbols with his finger. It felt almost alive. The symbols were etched into the very metal of the ship, as if they were part of the structure, embedded there somehow, making the ship itself feel like a vessel for something ancient and incomprehensible. At first, no one could make sense of the markings. They were too bizarre to be linked to anything they knew. But Stevens, driven by his growing understanding of the experiment and its consequences, began to believe that these symbols might be the key to unlocking the mystery. He recalled the story of the Philadelphia experiment, the very theories that had led to the ship's disappearance in the first place. The idea that the Eldridge wasn't just invisible, but had slipped through dimensions, traveling to a parallel world. Could these symbols be remnants of that world? Was the ship, in some way, trying to communicate with them? In the days that followed, the ship's strange behavior intensified. It wasn't just the symbols anymore. More anomalies appeared. The ship's engine, which had been completely shut down in the aftermath of the experiment, began to hum to life, unpredictably, erratically. The lights flickered, dimmed, and then came back on in waves. Some crew members swore they heard loud metallic banging beneath the ship's hull, as though something was moving beneath the steel. The walls of the ship began to groan, as if they were stretching and bending under the weight of some unseen pressure. And then came the letters. They started showing up in the most unlikely places, on the walls, on scraps of paper, and even in the condensation that appeared on the windows. The crew didn't understand at first, but when Stevens saw them, his blood ran cold. The letters were the same as the symbols etched into the ship's deck. They were writing, faint, unrecognizable, but undeniably present. Some of the crew attempted to decipher the symbols, but it was like trying to read a language from another dimension, one that didn't follow the rules of grammar or syntax. The letters seemed to change, morphing into new shapes, as if they were alive, constantly shifting to avoid comprehension. But what terrified Stevens the most was not the symbols themselves. It was what they represented. These weren't just random markings. They were signs of the other world, the one the Eldridge had somehow collided with. They were part of a message, a language that transcended time, a warning that the ship and its crew had stumbled into a place where time itself had no meaning. Stevens shared his findings with the remaining crew, urging them to take the symbols seriously. But not everyone agreed. Fear had begun to settle in the hearts of some of the men. Some of the officers believed that Stevens had gone mad, that he was becoming consumed by the same madness that had already begun to grip the ship. They tried to dismiss his warnings, chalking up the symbols to coincidence or the ravings of a stressed mind. But others, those who had witnessed the strange occurrences themselves, were beginning to question the rational explanations. Was it possible that the symbols were a form of communication? A message left behind by something that existed outside the fabric of their reality? Or was it a warning of something more dangerous? Despite the skepticism, Stevens pressed on. He gathered the remaining crew members who were still capable of coherent thought and began investigating the symbols more thoroughly. As they pieced together the markings and the strange occurrences, they realized they were dealing with something far older, far more sinister than they had ever imagined. One of the crew members, an officer named Lieutenant Robert West, found something that made the hair on the back of Stevens' neck stand on end. Deep in the lower decks, West had uncovered an ancient, weathered book, a journal that seemed completely out of place on the ship. It wasn't military issued, and it certainly wasn't part of the ship's standard equipment. The book was covered in the same strange symbols. Opening it, West began to read aloud. The writing was faded, barely legible, but the meaning was unmistakable. It was a story, a warning from someone who had been here before. The journal spoke of a ship, much like the Eldridge, that had disappeared, much like they had. The writer described a ship that had encountered something beyond the known world, something that tore apart the fabric of reality itself, leaving its crew trapped in a world they couldn't understand. The symbols in the journal matched the markings they had found on the ship. The words were clear. The boundaries between worlds are thin. Be cautious. The past cannot be outrun. It waits. The last part of the journal, however, was what sent chills through Stevens' spine. If you find this, it is already too late. You cannot escape the fate of the ship. Stevens had heard, enough. They weren't just dealing with a malfunctioning experiment. They were trapped in a cycle. The Eldridge wasn't just lost in time. It had become a vessel, a rift between worlds, and the crew was caught in its wake. The evidence was in front of them, undeniable. But it didn't offer answers, only more questions. Was it possible to escape? And if so, at what cost? In the next part, the crew will confront the reality of their situation. With the evidence mounting and the ship slipping further into the other world, they'll be forced to confront the terrifying truth. There may be no way out, not unless they risk everything to face the source of the supernatural forces haunting them. Stay tuned. The truth is getting darker, and the clock is ticking. The mystery surrounding the USS Eldridge deepened with every passing hour. The crew, once skeptical, now stood on the edge of a terrifying truth that none of them could have ever imagined. They had seen the inexplicable. They had witnessed the distortions in time and space. They had heard the whispers of the past, felt the chill of ghostly figures brushing against them, and seen things that didn't belong to this world. Yet despite the growing evidence that something supernatural, something far beyond human comprehension, was unfolding around them, no one knew what to do next. Stevens, driven by his need for answers, took it upon himself to push the investigation further. The symbols, the markings, the cryptic warnings from the journal, all pointed to one undeniable fact. The ship was caught in a rift between worlds, trapped in a reality that didn't belong to them. But could they escape? Was there a way to fix whatever had gone wrong with the Philadelphia experiment? Or was this their fate, to be lost in time forever? Stevens had to know. He gathered a small group of officers and engineers, those still capable of rational thought, and led them on a relentless search for more evidence. Their first goal was to find the origin of the symbols, to understand where they came from and what they meant. The symbols were clearly more than mere markings. They were a form of communication, perhaps even a warning, left behind by the forces at play in this dimension. But the deeper they dug, the more they uncovered, and the more terrifying it became. Their investigation began in the lower levels of the ship, where the vibrations of the Eldridge's distorted energy fields were strongest. It was here, amid the cold, dimly lit corridors, that they discovered the most disturbing evidence of all. One evening, while searching the engine room for anything that could explain the erratic behavior of the ship's systems, Stevens and his team stumbled upon something none of them could have anticipated: an artifact. It was an object, small but heavy, made of a dark, metallic substance that seemed to shimmer unnaturally. At first glance, it appeared to be nothing more than an old piece of equipment, perhaps part of a system long since forgotten. But as Stevens picked it up, he felt an unmistakable charge in the air around him. It was as if the object itself was alive, pulsing, humming with an energy he couldn't explain. The surface of the artifact was covered in the same strange symbols they had seen earlier, the same markings that had been etched into the ship's hull and walls. But this time, the symbols were moving. They shifted and changed as Stevens held the artifact, flickering in and out of focus like a mirage. The team stood frozen, unsure of what to make of it. Stevens, however, could feel something stir deep within him. A recognition, a sense of dread. He had seen objects like this before, in his dreams. He had seen them in that other world, that place the ship had collided with, the world where time had no meaning and the past and present existed as one. But before he could speak, a voice, faint but unmistakable, whispered in his ear, "The key is within the ship. It will show you the way, or lead you to your doom." Stevens turned, his heart racing, but there was no one behind him. The voice had come from nowhere, yet it had felt so real, so alive. Was it another echo from the ship, or was something else trying to reach out to them from the other side? With a trembling hand, Stevens placed the artifact on a nearby table, its strange energy crackling through the air. He knew they had to keep investigating. They had to understand what was happening before it was too late. But as the night wore on, The crew's growing unease became impossible to ignore. They weren't just dealing with strange occurrences anymore. They were dealing with a force that was not just trapped in the ship, but embedded in its very structure, wrapped around every system, every piece of metal, every wall. The ship was alive with it. And Stevens feared that whatever was inside the Eldridge had no intention of letting them leave. The next step in their investigation came when they decided to examine the ship's coordinates. They had already suspected that the Eldridge's bizarre journey through time and space might have left an imprint, a scar in reality. If the ship had indeed slipped through dimensions, perhaps they could find some trace, some residue that would lead them back to their own time. They made their way to the ship's navigation room, the one place that still had working equipment. The radar screens flickered to life, showing nothing but static. But as Stevens and his team pored over the readings, one of the engineers, Lieutenant Sandra Miller, pointed to something that made them all stop in their tracks. The readings on the radar weren't blank. They were distorted. The ship's position on the map wasn't matching up with reality. The coordinates they had been given placed them in the middle of the ocean, but the radar showed something else entirely. A jagged, chaotic pattern, like a hole in the fabric of space. It was as though the ship was floating in the middle of nothing, a void, a place that didn't belong. Stevens's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't just a malfunction. The ship wasn't in a safe location. It was at the epicenter of whatever had caused the Eldridge to slip between dimensions. The ship wasn't lost in time. It was stuck, trapped in an interdimensional rift, and the very fabric of reality around it was beginning to break down. The walls, the air, the crew, everything was starting to unravel. The Eldridge wasn't just a ship anymore. It was a gateway. And the more they searched for answers, the more they realized that they weren't going to find their way out. "We need to get out of here," Stevens muttered, his voice barely a whisper. "Before it's too late." But there was no easy escape. They couldn't outrun the phenomenon that had caught them. The Eldridge wasn't just caught in a pocket dimension. It had become one. Every moment they spent aboard the ship was pulling them deeper into the unknown, further away from the world they had once known. The more they dug, the more they uncovered about the ship's connection to the other world, and the more they understood just how close they were to the point of no return. In the coming days, things would get even worse. The crew would discover that leaving the ship was no longer an option. The boundaries of time and space would close in on them, trapping them in a cycle they couldn't break. They had walked into the rift, and now the rift was pulling them in, and there would be no escape unless they confronted the source, the entity that had brought them here. And when they did confront it, they would find that the true nature of their torment wasn't just supernatural. It was ancient, and it was watching them. In the next part of this journey, we'll follow Stevens and his crew as they face the terrifying truth behind the rift that has trapped them. The Eldridge's last moments in this world may not be about escape. They may be about something darker, the entity that controls the ship's fate. And this entity may have plans for them. Stay close. The answers are coming, and so is the terror. The USS Eldridge, now more a prison than a ship, had become the vessel of the unknown. The boundaries between worlds had twisted so thoroughly that reality itself had become unreliable. The crew, what remained of them, had descended into a madness of terror and confusion, unable to differentiate between what was real and what was an illusion. Time no longer existed as it should. The past bled into the present, and the future seemed as distant as the stars. Stevens, as the man who had witnessed the horrors firsthand, knew there was no going back. What they were facing aboard the ship wasn't just an anomaly. It was something far beyond their understanding. But now, there was a chilling realization that had become undeniable. They were no longer alone aboard the Eldridge. The ship itself had become a host to something far darker, something ancient, a force that had been awakened by the very rift in time they had unwittingly created. And that force, whatever it was, had begun to make its presence known. The crew had already seen the ghostly figures, the strange manifestations of soldiers long dead, and heard the inexplicable whispers of the past. But now, the encounters were becoming more direct, more tangible. The very fabric of the Eldridge was haunted by things not of this world. It started one night when a strange glow appeared along the walls of the ship, an eerie, unnatural light that seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. At first, the crew tried to ignore it, writing it off as another strange occurrence, a side effect of the ship's unpredictable state. But as Stevens made his way down one of the ship's narrow corridors, something caught his eye. A figure stood in the distance, faint at first, but growing clearer with each passing second. Stevens froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The figure wasn't like the ghostly soldiers they had seen before. This one, this thing, was alive in a way they had never experienced. It wasn't a spirit, a fragment of a lost soul. It was something more. As the figure grew nearer, Stevens could see its form more clearly. It was humanoid, but its body was twisted, contorted in ways that no human could possibly manage. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its skeletal frame, and its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, were dark voids that seemed to draw in the very light around them. The thing opened its mouth, but there was no sound. No words, just a sickening, unsettling feeling of something wrong, something foreign, invading their world. Stevens couldn't move. His legs felt like they were rooted to the spot, as if his body had been paralyzed by the sheer presence of the creature before him. And then it did something that left him breathless. The thing raised its hand, and in a slow, deliberate motion, it pointed directly at him. In that moment, Stevens felt the air around him grow cold, as though the very temperature of the ship had dropped several degrees. The shadows deepened, and a low, humming noise began to rise from somewhere deep within the bowels of the ship. It was a sound that rattled his bones, vibrating the very air around him. He knew then that this wasn't just a manifestation of the ship's fractured reality. It was an entity, a being tied to the rift between dimensions. It was something that had crossed over from the other side, something that had been waiting for them to arrive. And now, it had found them. The creature didn't advance. It didn't need to. Stevens could feel its presence in every fiber of his being, pulling at his mind, tugging at the very essence of his soul. It was as if the being was trying to speak to him, trying to make him understand something that was beyond his comprehension. But before he could react, the figure vanished, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as it had appeared. The air grew still again, and the ship returned to its unnatural silence. But Stevens knew one thing for certain. What they had encountered wasn't a ghost. It wasn't just a fragment of the past. It was a living, breathing entity that existed outside the bounds of time and space, and it was aware of them. As Stevens stumbled back to the crew's quarters, his mind raced. What had they uncovered? What had they awakened? He wasn't sure. But he knew that whatever was happening aboard the Eldridge was not a simple anomaly. It wasn't a failed experiment or an accidental tear in time. They were dealing with something far more dangerous, an entity, a force, that had been awakened by the rift. And that entity had no intention of letting them go. The next encounter came just a few days later, but this one was far more disturbing than the last. Lieutenant Robert West, a veteran sailor who had seen his fair share of strange occurrences, was on deck one evening when something caught his attention. At first he thought it was a trick of the light, but as he stared into the distance, he realized something was moving, something large in the water. The silhouette of a ship loomed on the horizon, massive, towering, its sails tattered and torn. But as West strained his eyes to see more clearly, he realized that the ship wasn't like anything he had ever seen before. Its hull was blackened and weathered, as though it had been lost to time for centuries. The ship's sails, too, were made of a strange, dark fabric, fluttering despite the lack of wind. And the worst part? The ship was coming towards them, moving at an unnerving speed, as if it were being pulled toward the Eldridge. West's heart raced as the ghostly ship drew closer. He could see figures moving on its deck, dark shapes, impossible to distinguish, but undoubtedly there. He ran to the control room, shouting orders to the crew, but when they arrived on deck, the ship had already vanished. It was gone, as if it had never been there in the first place. And yet, the feeling of dread lingered. The crew, once again, was left wondering. Was it a hallucination? Or was it something far more real? The encounters with the supernatural were escalating, and with each new appearance, the lines between the known world and the unknown became more and more blurred. Stevens knew they had to act. Whatever force was manipulating the ship, whatever this entity was growing stronger with each passing day. The encounters weren't random. They were deliberate, and it wasn't just a matter of survival anymore. They weren't just trapped in time. They were trapped in a war between the forces that had taken hold of the Eldridge and the crew who had stumbled into their world. But the question remained. Could they survive long enough to escape? As the crew faced new challenges, new horrors, Stevens knew they had to uncover the truth behind the entity's power. The ship was no longer just a vehicle. It had become a battleground. And whatever this entity was, it had no intention of letting them leave without a fight. In the next part of their journey, Stevens and the remaining crew will confront the source of the ship's torment. The encounter will be the culmination of everything they've experienced: the ship, the rift, and the entity that controls it all. They may have thought they were escaping the horrors of the past, but in reality, they were only walking deeper into its grip. The end of the Eldridge's journey may be closer than they think. Stay with us. The truth will be revealed, and so will the cost. The relentless horrors that had gripped the USS Eldridge were no longer just strange occurrences or fleeting moments of terror. They had become a constant, an inescapable force that gnawed at the edges of reality itself. Every hour aboard the ship felt like a lifetime, every second a reminder of the nightmare that they were caught in. The crew, once confident in their ability to withstand the madness, was now fraying at the edges. They had seen the creatures, the figures, the distortions in time, and heard the terrifying whispers. But now, the true horror was becoming apparent. The ship had lost its hold on the world. The Eldridge was no longer just a ship caught in an experiment gone wrong. It had become a prison, a vessel stranded between worlds, tethered to forces that no one could understand. The boundaries of time had warped and twisted so much that there was no telling where the ship was anymore, or when. Was it the present? Was it the past? Or was it somewhere in between, where time itself had no meaning? Stevens had always been the one to push for answers, to dig deeper, but even he was starting to lose hope. The more they searched for a way out, the more it became clear that the ship itself was fighting back. It wasn't just a machine. It was alive. Alive in a way that made their escape seem impossible. The crew had tried everything. They had tried to communicate with the outside world, using the ship's broken communication systems, but all they heard was static. The signals that had once gone out in the form of distress calls now came back to them distorted and garbled. as though the very air around them had been twisted. They had tried to navigate, using the maps and coordinates, but the readings were erratic. There was no telling where they were anymore. The ship had drifted into an unknown realm, and there was no turning back. And worst of all, the crew was vanishing. One by one, they were disappearing, pulled into the darkness of the ship's distorted corridors, swallowed by the rift between dimensions. First, it had been small things, sailors who wandered off in a daze, only to return hours later with no memory of where they'd been. Then, it had been officers, disappearing without a trace. Their belongings were left behind, their stations unmanned. No signs of struggle, no trace of where they had gone. It was as though the Eldridge itself was absorbing them, pulling them into the void. And now, Stevens stood in the heart of the ship, with a growing sense of dread clawing at him. There were only a few of them left. The others had either gone mad, disappeared, or been consumed by the ship itself. Stevens had come to realize that the entity on board, the one that controlled the ship's fate, was no longer just an external force. It had taken root inside the ship, inside them. It was in the walls, in the air, in the very essence of the ship. And it was getting stronger. The latest disappearance hit Stevens hard. Lieutenant Robert West, a trusted ally, had been found in the ship's control room, staring blankly at the radar. His skin had gone pale, his eyes empty. He hadn't moved when Stevens called out to him. But when Stevens touched his shoulder, West had turned to face him. And it wasn't West anymore. The man's face was distorted, his features warped, as though something had melded with him, something that was neither human nor creature. West's mouth opened, but no words came out, just a low, guttural sound, like a rattle. His eyes flickered with a strange light, and in that instant, Stevens knew. It wasn't Robert West anymore. It had taken him. The entity, the force that had invaded the ship, had claimed him. And now it was using him as a vessel. It was as if the crew had become pawns, sacrifices in a game they couldn't escape. Stevens had been forced to make a decision. He had to take the only remaining crew members, those still conscious, those still fighting the urge to submit to the madness, and find a way to destroy the rift. They had to destroy the entity, or the ship would continue to bleed into other worlds, its fate sealed by the twisted forces at play. But could they destroy it? Could they even survive long enough to make it happen? As Stevens and the remaining officers made their way deeper into the ship, they stumbled upon something even more horrifying. In the deepest part of the hold, where the power was strongest, where the ship seemed to breathe, they discovered the heart of the ship's torment. It wasn't just the rift that had torn reality apart. It was something older, something buried in the ship's deepest chambers, the source of the entity's power. It was an object, a relic, embedded in the ship's core. It was covered in the same symbols that had appeared on the walls, on the deck, on the artifact they had found earlier. But this object was different. It was an ancient, metallic structure, something that shouldn't have existed on a 20th century warship. It was as though it had been placed there long before the Eldridge had been commissioned, something that had been waiting for this moment. Stevens approached it cautiously, the air growing colder as he did. The object pulsed with a sickly light, humming as if it were alive. He could feel the entity watching him, listening. It wanted him to approach. It wanted him to surrender. But Stevens wasn't about to give in. The officers, now trembling with fear, gathered around the relic, unsure of what to do. Stevens knew they had to destroy it. But how? How could they destroy something so powerful, something that had warped time itself? They tried everything they could think of, attempting to overload the ship's power grid, detonating explosives near the object, even attempting to use the ship's remaining weapons. But nothing worked. The object was impervious to everything they threw at it. In a final act of desperation, Stevens placed his hand on the object. He had no idea what would happen, if the entity would consume him, if the ship would collapse, or if they would finally be able to escape. But in that moment, as his palm made contact with the cold metal, he felt a jolt, a surge of energy, sharp and painful, shooting up his arm. The ship shuddered violently, and the lights flickered out. For a moment, everything went dark. When Stevens opened his eyes, he was no longer in the hold. He was standing on the deck of the USS Eldridge. But it was different. The ship looked normal. The distortions were gone. The walls no longer groaned. The air felt real again. He was back. But as Stevens stood there, staring at the calm ocean that surrounded them, a chilling thought crept into his mind. Was this truly the end? Had the rift closed for good? Or had they just stepped into a new reality altogether? And if they had escaped, what had become of the others? What had become of the entity that had ruled the ship? The final answer wasn't clear, but one thing was certain. The truth had been uncovered, and the horrors of the USS Eldridge were far from over. In the next part, we'll delve into the consequences of their actions and the repercussions of tampering with forces beyond human comprehension. The final confrontation with the entity might not be over, and the price of their survival might be far greater than they ever imagined. Stay with us. The final chapter is about to unfold. The calm that followed the violent shudder of the USS Eldridge was unsettling. Stevens stood on the deck, staring out at the ocean. The air, once thick with tension and fear, felt almost normal again. The horizon stretched out before him, a serene vista that should have brought him peace. But there was something deeply wrong about this moment. He had felt the shift when the entity's power had surged through him, and now it felt as though time itself had been bent, twisted into something unrecognizable. What had happened? Had they truly escaped the rift? Or had they simply passed into a different version of reality, a reality where the horrors of the Eldridge had yet to unfold? Stevens couldn't shake the feeling that something followed them, something that had been left behind, but was still watching. The air, now eerily still, felt like a quiet before a storm. He could still feel the presence of the entity, like a shadow at the edge of his mind, lingering just beyond his reach. The crew gathered slowly, a mixture of exhaustion, confusion, and dread in their faces. They had seen too much, survived too much. And yet, as they stood there, they realized that nothing had truly been resolved. The relic, the object at the heart of the ship's torment, had been destroyed, or so they thought. But was it really gone? Could something so powerful, so ancient, simply be eradicated with a touch? Or had they merely delayed the inevitable? The questions, the unknowns, they clung to Stevens like a suffocating fog. And then, like a distant drumbeat, came a realization. They hadn't found all the answers. There were pieces to this puzzle still hidden in the darkest corners of the ship, pieces that might hold the key to understanding what had truly happened to them, and what the future would hold. But before Stevens could contemplate this any further, a voice broke through the silence. It was Lieutenant Miller, who had been one of the last to witness the entity's presence, her face pale with the same dread that had marked the others. She held something in her hand, a small, weathered book, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. She had found it buried deep in the archives of the ship's control room, hidden among other forgotten records. As soon as she opened it, she had felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up, and the weight of the object in her hand made her uneasy. Stevens approached her, his heart racing. The book was old, far older than anything they had found aboard the ship. There was something familiar about it, something wrong. The pages were filled with symbols, the same ones they had seen etched into the ship's walls, the same ones that had appeared on the mysterious artifact. But there was more. In the margins of the pages, in faint handwriting, were notes, notations in a language none of them could recognize. As Stevens took the book, a chilling thought crossed his mind. Could this be the origin of the rift? Had they somehow stumbled upon a record of the ancient force that had taken control of the Eldridge? He turned the pages carefully, his fingers tracing the strange writing. The symbols, now more than ever, seemed to pulse with an energy that made the air grow thick with static. And then, at the back of the book, a final page, one that had been torn, its edges scorched and burned, revealed a chilling diagram. It was a depiction of a ship, the Eldridge perhaps, surrounded by what looked like an opening, a tear in the very fabric of space, and in the center of the tear, a dark, amorphous figure, its form indistinct, its presence overwhelming. Stephen stared at the page, his blood running cold. The diagram was more than just a drawing. It was a blueprint, an outline of the ship's transformation during the experiment, an illustration of how the ship had become a vessel for the entity, the force that had torn through reality. The force had used the ship as a conduit, a way to enter the world. And now, with the ship broken, torn apart by the failed experiment, the entity was free to reach into every dimension it desired, to spread its influence across the timeline. Stephen's heart thudded heavily in his chest. This wasn't just a military experiment. It wasn't just an accident gone wrong. This had been planned. Someone had known what the Eldridge was going to become. They had orchestrated it, created the vessel that could channel the power of the rift. The entity was no accident. It had been summoned, invited. But who had invited it? The answer was hidden in the last piece of the book, scrawled in a hurried hand, as if the writer knew their time was running out. The ship is the key. Once it crosses the threshold, it cannot be undone. The rift will open and the darkness will return. There is no stopping it. The only choice is to let the ship burn before the void consumes everything. The final sentence sent a shiver down Stevens's spine. There was no stopping it. The ship had been part of something much greater, an opening, a key to something far beyond human comprehension. And now the rift was threatening to unravel everything. As Stevens closed the book, the weight of the knowledge hit him. They were running out of time. The rift wasn't gone. The entity hadn't been destroyed. It had merely been contained. And as long as the Eldridge existed, the rift would continue to pulse, slowly tearing at the fabric of the world, spreading the darkness until there was nothing left. But it wasn't just the ship's fate that was at stake. It was theirs, too. They were all connected now, bound to the rift in ways they couldn't yet understand. They had witnessed it, touched it, and now the entity's presence was embedded in their very souls. They had to destroy the ship, destroy the rift, before it was too late. But how? Could they even survive the attempt? Could they close the gateway they had opened without paying the ultimate price? As Stevens glanced at the remaining crew members, all standing in stunned silence, he knew one thing for sure. The hardest part of this journey was yet to come. They had discovered the final secret, the origin of the rift, the source of their torment. But what now? Could they truly break free? Or were they doomed to live out the rest of their lives trapped within the twisted remnants of the Eldridge, pulled between dimensions, eternally haunted by the entity that had once controlled them? There was no turning back. They would face the final confrontation, the destruction of the rift, and they would either break free or be consumed. In the next part, the crew will take their last stand, armed with the knowledge they've uncovered and the terrifying power they've unleashed. It's a race against time as they fight to destroy the Eldridge and close the rift before the entity fully takes hold. The ultimate confrontation awaits, and the price of survival may be more than they can bear. Stay close. The final battle is upon them. The silence that had descended upon the USS Eldridge was shattered only by the low hum of the ship's malfunctioning engines. It was as though the very heart of the ship was still beating, but barely. The crew, having uncovered the final secret, were left with only one option: destroy the rift. Destroy the entity that had made the Eldridge its vessel. But the knowledge they had gained from the ancient book only served to increase the fear that had already gripped them. Could they really erase what had been set in motion? Could they fight something that had waited for centuries to escape its prison? As Stevens and the remaining crew gathered in the control room, preparing for what was to come, a wave of unease settled over them. The ship was eerily quiet now. No ghostly apparitions. No strange figures. The lights flickered, but there was a calm that hadn't been there before. It was almost too quiet. And that, more than anything else, made Stevens nervous. There was something waiting. He could feel it, just beyond the veil of reality. Something was stirring, preparing to come back. "We need to hurry," Stevens said, his voice filled with urgency. "Whatever happens next, we can't let the entity gain control again. We have one chance." The plan was simple, or at least it had seemed so when they first formulated it. They needed to destroy the artifact, the object that had connected the Eldridge to the rift. But even as they had prepared for this final confrontation, a nagging fear kept tugging at Stevens' mind. What if it was already too late? They had already seen what happened when they tried to break the ship free of the rift. Every time they pushed, it fought back. It was as if the Eldridge itself was protecting the force that had taken root inside it. This was no longer just a physical ship. It was a living, breathing entity, alive with the force that had been unleashed. But how could they destroy it? The question remained unanswered. But there was no time left to dwell on it. They were already deep within the belly of the ship, standing at the threshold of the entity's heart. Then, without warning, the ship began to hum again. It was soft at first, a subtle vibration beneath their feet. But within moments, the humming grew louder, reverberating through the metal walls, vibrating the very bones of the ship. The air grew thick, charged with energy. Something was happening. Something was coming. Stevens gripped the edge of the control panel, trying to steady himself as the force around them intensified. And then it happened. The ship shifted. A violent tremor shook the Eldridge, throwing the crew off balance as the floor buckled beneath them. The walls groaned, and the lights flickered wildly, casting eerie shadows that danced along the corridor. The air grew colder, and the whispers returned, louder this time. Unintelligible voices echoed through the ship, their tone one of malice and command, a dark presence that pressed against their minds. For a brief moment, the ship disappeared. Not physically, but mentally. Everything around Stevens blurred, the world around him stretching, distorting, and pulling apart. Time and space warped, and he could see it. The rift, open wide, beyond the walls of the ship. The entity, its form, its dark presence, hovered just beyond reach. It was no longer just a force. It was alive, conscious, watching. "No!" Stevens shouted, pulling himself back to reality. He could feel the entity's presence growing stronger, tugging at his mind, dragging him toward the rift. His body shook, the force pulling him closer and closer to the threshold, to the void. He fought it, pushing against the pull, but it was so much stronger than anything he had faced before. The ship was no longer just a place. It was a gateway, a point where dimensions collided, and the entity, that dark force that had used them, that had haunted them, was ready to take its final form. And then, As though the ship had heard Stephen's thoughts, everything stopped. The humming faded. The vibrations died. The pull of the rift was gone. But the calm was deceiving. The crew, all of them, could feel it. A presence that wasn't from this world. Stevens turned to face the others. Lieutenant Miller was pale, her hands shaking as she clutched the book that had led them this far. The fear was written on their faces, and Stevens knew what had to be done. "We can't hesitate," he said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "We've seen what happens when we give it time to grow. We have to destroy the artifact. The ship is the key. If we don't stop it now, if we don't close the rift, the world as we know it will be lost." But just as they moved toward the artifact, something changed. A voice. A cold, hollow whisper, like wind cutting through a mountain pass, echoed through the control room. It came from everywhere, from the ship itself, as though it was speaking to them all at once. "You cannot stop what has already begun. The rift is eternal. The void will return. The ship belongs to me now." The walls of the ship began to shimmer, warping as though they were made of liquid. The entire structure of the Eldridge was alive, bending and contorting in ways that were impossible to explain. The entity had taken over. It had become the ship. The ship itself was no longer a vessel. It was the prison, the gate, and the conduit. But even as the ship trembled with the weight of the entity's power, Stevens didn't back down. He couldn't afford to. The crew, what was left of them, could only go forward. If they didn't, they would be lost, swallowed by the darkness that had already consumed the ship. And so, they moved toward the artifact, the last step toward either salvation or their doom. As Stevens reached out to touch the object, the ship reacted. The moment his fingers brushed against the relic, a violent explosion of energy surged through the room. The ship buckled, groaning as if it were in pain. The walls shook, and the air crackled with a high-pitched noise that threatened to tear their eardrums apart. The entity screamed, a sound that was not human, not even alive. It was an ancient cry, an infinite, timeless sound of rage. The room was bathed in blinding light. And for a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The ship, the rift, the very fabric of time, it all stood still. And then, with a deafening crack, everything shattered. Stevens and the crew were thrown back, their bodies slamming into the walls as the ship erupted in a violent explosion of light and sound. The world around them twisted, torn apart as the Eldridge was torn from its reality, the rift collapsing in on itself. The presence of the entity faded, like smoke blown away by the wind, and the strange, unnatural force that had once ruled the ship vanished. For a moment, there was silence. And then the ship, their ship, was gone. Stevens awoke, lying on the cold, hard ground. The air was still. The eerie hum of the Eldridge was absent. He lifted his head, looking around. The landscape before him was unfamiliar. The crew lay scattered around him, some stirring, others motionless. But one thing was clear. The ship was gone. The rift had closed, and whatever had happened, the entity, the force that had tried to consume them, it was no longer in this world. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Stevens allowed himself to breathe. The nightmare was over. But was it really? They had survived. But the truth of what had happened aboard the USS Eldridge would linger forever in their memories, a dark mark on the fabric of time. The answers they had uncovered had cost them everything. And though they had escaped the rift, they couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere deep in the universe, the entity still waited, biding its time, ready to return. And if it did, who would be there to stop it? The battle was over. But the war against the unknown had only just begun. Thank you for following this mysterious journey. If you found the story compelling, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more thrilling adventures. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Did you think the Eldridge's story was truly over? Or is something more lurking just beyond the veil? See you in the next journey.